All right, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. Welcome everyone to this micro-focus webinar on GroupWise Disaster Recovery. My name is Q Mangus. I'm the product marketing manager here at Microfocus, and we're joined by Stephen Cohen, sales engineer. Today we're going to be talking about disaster recovery with GroupWise and the push button functionality that it has and the failover as well. But before we get started with that, I just want to make mention of a few items. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, so you can review this at another time or share it with any coworkers or anyone. So you'll be getting an email shortly with that recording. Also, if you have questions, we will have time at the end for questions and answer, but if you have them as we're going along, feel free to put those through in the question panel there in GoToWebinar, and we'll hit on those as well as we're going through. So let's go ahead and jump in to this presentation. So I will be walking through a few items, and then Stephen will be showing a demo and going through the product here. Just some things to be aware of, and for everyone who's on this call, is that you need to be prepared for disaster. That's kind of the point of the solution that we're going to be talking about. But in general, there are things that could happen to your organization that can take down your email system. And in this case, we're talking about GroupWise. So, of course, internal disasters could be hardware failure, human error, some sort of crash or a network failure, or maybe even a malicious attack. Those are things that could take down your live system. And then, of course, external disasters, some of them that I've listed out there. The idea with this, and the reason why I like to show this, is that there's a good chance that something could happen to your email system, to your GroupWise system, so that it will go down. And the point of the solution we're going to talk about is we're giving you a way to be able to recover from those types of disasters easily and quickly, and also have a backup of your system. Some recent information. There was a survey in November of 2010 that found that North American businesses collectively lose about $26.5 billion in revenue because of downtime and a result of slow recovery from that downtime. And once again, another estimate is that the ability to generate revenue is reduced by nearly a third. And then, of course, if even after a service is restored, there's an additional 7.5 hours of compromised operation because of the time it takes to recover lost data. So the idea here is that downtime can cost you money, and it can cost you time. And so you need to make sure that your systems stay up and running, and especially with email as such a critical system in your organization for being able to communicate internally with external people as well. You need to be able to make sure that system stays up and running, and if something does happen, that you have a failover. Here's just a quick and dirty example of an email disruption. This is, say, an organization of about 250 users and an average employee hourly cost of about $30 per hour, which is probably pretty conservative. But the idea here is if there's a disruption, that loss of productivity starts to grow exponentially as your system is down. So just a 5-minute downtime can cost $600 plus, and it can grow as that downtime continues. So it's really important that your email system stays up and running, and if anything happens, that you have a failover. What's interesting is that a recent survey found that about half of small to medium businesses don't even have business continuity or disaster recovery plans. So I would encourage everyone on this call that if you don't have one, that you get one, that you work towards getting a disaster recovery or business continuity plan, and that, of course, that plan, part of that plan would be to have a solution for your GroupWise email. And part of that plan is this is just, obviously there's much more to it, but this is just some quick and dirty small steps that you can take to help protect your data and make sure you have that, is know where your data is stored. Make sure that data has a redundancy, that you have a failover, that you have a backup, that you can access that redundancy, and that you can practice and test your plan. So whatever your plan is, of course, we're going to talk about GroupWise Disaster Recovery and how that can help with failover and backup, and how you can actually test that as well. Make sure that you have created that plan, you know where your data is stored, that you have redundancy, and that you can practice and test that plan. So those are some things that you can do starting today to make sure that you are covered in case of any of those disasters that we talked about, whether those are internal or external disasters. So now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen, and he's going to go through and demonstrate to us GroupWise Disaster Recovery, how it works, some of the overview of it as well. So let me make him the presenter here. Just a moment.
All right, great. Thanks, Q. And thanks, everybody. So let's talk a little bit more about disaster recovery and restoration for GroupWise. So the next few slides are more technical in nature. So we're going to get a little bit more in-depth here and a little bit into the weeds. We might even open up a notepad session or two to get really propeller head over here. And then I hope we'll have some questions that you're able to pose at the end. And we'll do a quick demo and then take care of those questions. So you can type any questions that you have into the chat window. So you don't forget them. You don't need to wait. Just type them into the chat, and then Q will be able to read those out at the end of the webinar. Okay, so I figured the first thing that we should do here is explain just what our GroupWise disaster recovery system is and how it works. And then we can talk a bit about the features. So with an understanding, kind of a 10,000 foot understanding of how the system works, you can probably understand why we claim to have said features and how they might work. All right, so here's the quick 10,000 foot diagram here. On the left side of the diagram here, we have our GroupWise system. So that's represented by one server here, though your GroupWise system can be as many servers as you need it to be. So you can have it all on one system. That's a POA, MTA, even a GUIA all on one server, or you can have a GroupWise system spread out among 20 POAs, a whole bunch of MTAs, and spread around different offices even. They don't even need to be co-located in the same spot. But on this diagram, since we're so up high in the air, that's just represented by one server. At the right side of the diagram, this is our GroupWise Dr server. And at the bottom of the diagram, these are your GroupWise clients. Okay, so what is the GroupWise Dr server? This is a server that must be installed on SUSE Enterprise Linux server, either version 11 or 12. And there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that server only supports SLES, okay, no Windows. We support backing up GroupWise, whether GroupWise is installed on SLES or Windows. So SLES installations of GroupWise or OES installations of GroupWise or Windows installations of GroupWise are supported. Now, the GroupWise Dr server will connect to the GroupWise systems using either a Windows mount, an NFS share, depending on what systems your GroupWise servers are running on, whether Linux or Windows, and it will take scheduled backups of the data. All right, so it basically sucks down all the post office information, and it sucks down all the domain information as well. It just basically does a file copy, and it does a DB. It uses DB copy to copy over the GroupWise databases. Okay, and that's the high-level view. There's a bunch of cool things going on that we'll get into in the following slides for that backup. Now, the really amazing thing about the GroupWise Dr server on the right side of the diagram here is not that it's taking file copies of GroupWise, because just about any server can do that. It has post office agents and MTA agents running on that server. Okay, so that's why you can see your GroupWise client at the bottom. They can connect to this server. This is where the power of the GroupWise Dr system that we sell comes into play here, is because your GroupWise clients can connect to that server and can connect to the post office agent that is running on that server. That means that you can fail over. If you lose your GroupWise system over here, we actually used to have a really fun video that I was trying to look up before the webinar here, with somebody taking a sledgehammer to a GroupWise server and actually just smashing it into oblivion and then failing over to GroupWise that I want to show, but we couldn't find the video. So hopefully we're going to be making that video, and stay tuned. Q will send out notifications so we can all see what this means in practice. But you can lose that server, whether you have some, very upset IT person. Everyone on the line, of course, is excluded from this because no one here gets upset. But either they take a sledgehammer to your server, it catches on fire, or a more realistic example would be, hard drive or RAID failure or network failure, anything that brings your GroupWise server down. Your client will then fail over to the post office agents that are running on the GroupWise DR server, and then they can make use of that server to send and receive email, also have access to the email from the last backup, and then they can use that server again to send and receive because it's a failed over system. Your GUIA could be there, your GUIA and all your MTAs will talk to that server, and you can be off fixing your GroupWise system while your clients are failed over, okay? And when your system is finally up, it could be up an hour later in the case of, maybe a network card failure, or it might be up, a couple of days later in the case of that sledgehammer went to your GroupWise server. Either case, the next step, and we'll get into that a little bit later, is to then migrate the changes back. So when we talk about push button disaster recovery, one of the buttons that you press is migrate back. GroupWise DR will then send back all the changes that have been made over the past 2 days, for example, basically doing a reverse backup job, pushing that data back into GroupWise. And the last step or button is fail back. Clients are then disconnected from the GroupWise DR server on the right and then fail back over to the GroupWise server on the left. Okay, that is DR, push button DR. Take a moment to digest. We'll get into a little bit more detail soon. And then please, any questions about how this actually works, type into your chat and we can handle that towards the end of the webinar. Finally, it's also a backup and restore system. So clients can restore their email via the GroupWise DR. And the way we do this, and I'll get into an example soon, is by way of the restoration area of GroupWise. So the restoration area, for those who are familiar with it, is configured to point to the DR server. So when clients click File Open Backup, the POA will open a location that exists on the GroupWise DR server, which contains the most recent backups. Okay, that's a lot of information actually for a 10,000-foot overview. So we'll take a moment to digest that, and then we'll move on to some of the features. Disaster recovery and backup for GroupWise, obviously we know what that means. Hot backups. So when we talk about hot backups, we use this term a lot. What we mean is that you don't need to load anything to access the most recent backup of GroupWise. The DR system will automatically, once it finishes the backup, it will automatically load that backup into two spots. Spot number one is that restoration area. So when a client clicks File Open Backup in their GroupWise client, they will automatically see their most recently backed up data. So if they just deleted something, they can click that and poof, it's right there. Administrator doesn't need to do anything. And then secondly, is loaded into the disaster recovery area. So if you click on the disaster recovery button, which we'll see soon, it will load the most recent backup, which is obviously what you want. Immediate recovery and full restoration. So that goes into what I just spoke about, the push button. So you click that one button and the GroupWise DR system will load that post office agent, that special post office agent, which allows users to fail over to, which is the next bullet point, and send and receive email. Backup versus disaster recovery. This is a very important bullet point on this slide here, because I have over the years, we've been talking about this. For those who are familiar with the roots of this system, actually the last bullet point notes that this solution is powered by Reload. That is the technology which has been available for about 15 years now. Over the course of me talking about this, over the last, I've been doing it for about 8 years. A lot of organizations didn't think they needed a backup system or a DR system for one of the following reasons. They didn't need a backup system because they have DR for GroupWise. They have, failover in VMware, they can fail over, or vice versa. They didn't need disaster recovery because they're taking nightly backups for GroupWise. In the first example, and then this is why, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but this is why the two things are different. Just because you're failing over, you have that all sorted out, doesn't mean that you can recover if your files are damaged. Corruption, in this day and age, it's prudent to talk about, crypto malware that can get in there and encrypt your files. Anything like that, a failover is not useful. So a backup system plus a DR system, which is the one that we're talking about today, where you can fail over to the last good backup, makes sense. Now, if you just have a backup of GroupWise, and everyone on this phone has a backup of GroupWise, otherwise, we might need to talk offline for a bit. Now, of course, you need to have a quick way to fail over your users. I don't know about your organizations, but here at Micro Focus, if, for example, if our salespeople or inside salespeople don't have email for 5 minutes, they're packing their bags and they're heading home because there's actually nothing for them to do. So email is obviously very important. It's known as a tier 1 corporate application. So therefore, your failover needs to be within minutes or seconds, not within hours. The push button DR for GroupWise Disaster Recovery enables you to do that because it's just one click of a button. Moving on to the next slide here, some more features. GroupWise Smart Purge integration. Very important. For those of you not familiar with the Smart Purge functionality of GroupWise, this has been in the system that is GroupWise for many years now. What it does is, if enabled, it will not allow any user to delete and purge any item which has not been backed up by GroupWise DR. Okay, so what actually happens as far as an end user's perspective is if they try to delete and empty that trash can, they'll notice that the item does not ever leave the trash can. In fact, it's quite sticky. It won't ever leave that trash can until it's been backed up that evening, or we have some customers that do intraday backups, could be an hour later, that item will not be purgeable from GroupWise. So important. Okay, so the next couple of points here are all kind of related. Backup speeds are extremely fast. Why? Because only 12% of the PO is replicated and stored each day. Okay, and every backup is equivalent to a full backup of the post office. And on disk, it looks just like a GroupWise PO. What does this all mean in practice? Okay, so it's time for me to move into our notepad. These slides have been designed by our wonderful marketing people such as Q, but when it comes to me and my creative mind cannot go much further than notepad. So apologies there. So let me grab notepad here and explain what's going on here. All right, so GroupWise post offices are basically comprise 2 main pieces of data. Okay, number 1 are the blob files. Now, blob stands for binary large object, just binary files really, like images or message body information, PDF attachments, all that stuff is known as a blob file. Now, in practice, these files make up about 85 to 90% of the data in a post office. Okay, that makes sense because, message body information is stored there as well. Number 2 are the database files, the user database, or rather the message databases. Now, these contain the header information, subject line, to, from, address fields, date stamps, all that stuff. Basically, everything you see in a GroupWise from the GroupWise client associated with an item before you click and open that item is stored in the database. Okay, this data, just basically the metadata or very high level metadata, makes up about 15 to 10% of the data. Probably got those numbers reversed. It should be 10% to 15% of the data. Okay, so why only 12% is replicated during each backup? Because our backup system only does an incremental copy of number 1. All right, so only incremental of the blob files are copied each backup. Okay, and that is about very small percentage of the changes day to day. Okay, because it's only the new file. So when you take your whole post office into consideration, it makes up about 10% to daily. Okay, and then we copy all the databases. Okay, so you cannot do incremental copies of databases. This is, of course, the Flame database of GroupWise, which has been the system that GroupWise has used since oh boy, I think before I was born, you must copy them in their entirety. So we do that, and we use DB copy to do that. That is the Micro Focus tool that allows you to actually copy the databases without having to close GroupWise, because otherwise they're locked and cannot be copied in any normal fashion. We use DB copy to copy the databases, and since the databases only make up about 10% of the data, and then about 2% is left over for the incremental blob files, that's why we get away with only making an incremental copy of the data. Okay. The next point said that every backup is equivalent to a full backup of GroupWise. Why? Because on the back end, we use symbolic links to stitch everything together. Okay. My spelling is failing me. Group all files together. So basically what this means is, and this is why the system has to be on SLES, because we use the symbolic linking available on Linux to do this, which is much more usable than the symbolic links on Windows, to basically stitch all the backups together with the incremental backups with the master copy of the blobs. So that's why we don't need to ever copy the blobs. We only need to do that full copy once, and then every incremental copy from the file system basically looks like it's got all the data, but it's just, most of the data is just pointing to symbolically to the original data that we backed up the first time. Hopefully you can follow that. If not, please ask a question and we can get into more details later. So that's really the magic of the system and why it's so fast. So basically, I would say that any average size post office will back up in its entirety incrementally in under 60 minutes. Normally it's under 30 minutes. Okay. And this is the reason why GroupWise Disaster Recovery servers can also be implemented off-site because of the small amount of data that we need to copy over the wire. Makes it very, very good solution for an off-site disaster recovery plan. And in fact, you can have one GroupWise Disaster Recovery server on premises, and you can set up another one off-site, and they can mirror each other over the WAN. And you do not need to pay any extra licensing for the extra server. As you know, we just license per user. You can set up as many servers as you want. If you don't have an off-site location for that server, we do have hosted plans where you can make use of our data center for your off-site DR plan. GroupWise client integration. So basically, when we talk about GroupWise client integration here, nothing to install on the GroupWise client. End users can restore their own email, document management libraries, and provide backup and push button disaster recovery for GroupWise domains. What we're basically talking about here are two things: the GroupWise restoration area, which I spoke about earlier, and as far as document management is concerned, we can back up document management and make it accessible to users if the document management files are stored underneath the post office. Okay, so they need to be stored along with the post office data underneath that tree. We can copy that data. Okay, so let me quickly show you some screenshots here about how to set up the restoration area. Okay, because this is what makes restoring items from off of the disaster recovery server so easy that even end users can do that themselves. So, so the first step here is to set up a NFS server on your reload, or rather your GroupWise Disaster Recovery. Sorry if I say reload, but they basically mean the same thing. I'm still getting used to the branding changes here. You start up your NFS server and you basically point it to your post office. So underneath this path here, this is where all your post office backups exist. Okay. Each post office has its own path, and each server can back up 11 post offices. Okay. If you have more than 11 post offices, you'll just have to set up another server. And then once that path is exported on your GroupWise server, either Linux or Windows, you mount that NFS. Luckily, Windows server actually has quite a good NFS client. You mount this location And then in your GroupWise administration, you point the restoration area to that path and the restore directory underneath there. Now, this restore directory will contain all the data of the most recent backup. And every time that the system makes a new backup, it will automatically load that most recent data here. So no need to change it. Now it's all pointed to the correct location. Users can then click File, Open Backup, and then poof, their backup email is available to them. And again, you just need to, they didn't put the final screenshots missing, but you simply right click on one of these files and then you'll see the option to undelete or restore. And then it will put it right back into the live mailbox. Super easy. Okay, so that's what we call self-service, because the end user does not need to call anybody. They just go there. All right, the only, now they would have to call, for example, if they deleted something, say, 3 days ago or last week, and they only realized that they needed that backup today. They would need to call administration, because administration would need to go in and load a previous backup. So as you see in this screenshot here, you can load a previous backup, and then you select from the drop-down box which backup you want to load. You turn that access on, and then the user will find the item that they deleted last week, for example. Okay, so normally customers keep about 2 weeks worth of data on the GroupWise Disaster Recovery server. Now, the next number is very cool, so pay attention. Each week of data only requires about 150% of the total post office size. That's 7 days of backups require 150% of your total size. So if your post office comprises 100 gigabytes of data on your GroupWise server, 7 backups worth of that data will take up about 150 gigabytes on your GroupWise Disaster Recovery. Not a lot more, and that is why customers typically keep about 2 weeks or 1 week of data available for hot restoration on that server. Otherwise, the system has provisions to automatically, once that 2 weeks or 1 week is up, to push that backup data to tape for long-term storage, depending on what your backup policy might be. But the system can automatically push things to tape using tar. So that's really cool. So nothing to install in the GroupWise client, because we're just making use of GroupWise features such as restoration area. Now, quickly, to restore GroupWise documents, you might know that you cannot restore documents from document management using restoration area. Same thing goes for address books. However, you can make use of another feature of disaster recovery. The feature list doesn't end. In fact, we probably need to make a new slide here, Q, because there are more features to talk about. Another feature called access mode. Basically, what access mode does is it just loads a post office agent that the user can connect their GroupWise client to. So that means they need to close their GroupWise client, open it up again, and point it to this to the GroupWise Disaster Recovery server. And then they will be able to see, the GroupWise client will be able to see everything that was in that post office at the time of the last backup, including their address books and including their documents as well. So they can export an address book, or they can export a document and then bring it back to the live system by disconnecting the client and reconnecting it to GroupWise live server. So that access mode post office agent is probably something that an administrator needs to help, or help desk needs to help the user with. However, the restoration area and clicking file open backup is something that end users can easily do on their own. Additional features, intraday backups. So instead of performing backups just daily, which is probably typical, the system is so fast that we have customers that do hourly backups. Why hourly backups or intraday backups? Because there's a rule of physics that our system cannot cheat, and that is that in a disaster, you're only as good as your most recent backup. That is a rule that no one has figured out how to get around. So some customers who are very sensitive to losing data, they do intraday backups. And we have customers that do it hourly. So it can be done and it's easy to do. Concurrent backup, so the system will create up to 5 threads, backup up to 5 post office simultaneously. Migration of data for new hardware, new platform, newly repaired GroupWise system post-disaster. What this means is it goes back to something I mentioned earlier, the migrate button. So when you click the migrate button, it does that reverse backup and pushes all the data back. Okay, so let's say you're building a new GroupWise server. All you need to do is load up the GroupWise agents, and then you just hit that migration feature. You just basically pretend that there was a disaster, and you hit that migration button, and then your GroupWise DR server will push all the data back onto that new server that you just brought up. Same thing goes for migrating from NetWare to Linux. There might be one person here that may still have GroupWise on NetWare, maybe one. They do exist, I know. In fact, I was just speaking to a customer yesterday that had GroupWise 5, and they wanted to upgrade to GroupWise 2014. That's going to take some work. But we can migrate from NetWare to Linux in the same fashion. You basically build a new Linux server, put the agents on there, and just push all the data back with the migration feature. Obviously, you need to connect the 2 servers with NFS, for example, so that they can actually push the data, but that's all you need to do. Same thing goes to the last bullet there. Up to 2 weeks of GroupWise functionality on reload server. We write 2 weeks there because that's what people normally keep, and I mentioned that just before. 2 weeks of data, but you can keep 3 or 4. All you need is big hard drives. That's all that's required. Peace of mind, push button disaster recovery, a consolidated daily status report, warnings, at-a-glance monitoring, and every time you use GroupWise DR for storing an email, you're validating your GroupWise recovery plan. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about recovery plans and that kind of stuff by way of a demo, which is what we're going to show you here. So the server that we're looking at over here, this is a server that our QA engineer is using to back up a whole bunch of post offices, as we see here. There's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They're numbered. I didn't have to count them, but I did anyway. 9 post offices, 1 domain being backed up to this GroupWise Disaster Recovery. You see at a glance here what's going on. We see that the most current backup that's loaded here is Monday, January 22nd. So that's yesterday. So that makes complete sense here. You also see here that the disk is about 50% of the way used. So that's important to understand. Just because we're moving into a live system here and we're playing around with a live server, I need to do a little disclaimer that if anything happens, I apologize in advance, even though we ran through this before. Live servers, you never quite know, but it should all be good. All right, so let's open up with Jedi here. I guess maybe he's a fan of the last movie. We won't get into that. But we can see at a glance here what's going on. Latest backup summary. The backup completed in 2 minutes and 46 seconds. The average time to complete this backup of this post office is 3 minutes and 3 seconds, okay? Obviously, this post office is not big. It's running on a QA system here, but they do some load testing, so it's not like tiny. I promise you there's more than a dozen emails in there. As you can see, very fast system. Now, this button here I'm going to click on next is a really, really cool button, and this is why I saved this towards the end, because I like to wow people towards the end of demos. Blueprint reports. So there's a lot of data that's hanging out on the GroupWise Disaster Recovery server, weeks of backups of GroupWise, clones of GroupWise, etc. So why don't we do something with that data? 99.99% of the time, you're not using that data for anything, and that's a good thing, because that means you're not in disaster recovery, and that means your users don't need to restore anything. So why don't we run GW checks on that data weekly and generate reports? And that's a feature called Blueprint. So it's automatically scheduled for you. You don't need to worry about configuring GW check or running it on the server for you. And then you can get these reports emailed to you, and you can get summary reports of what's going on inside of your post office here, size of your post office, size of your inactive mailboxes, et cetera, et cetera. The user reports where it really gets cool. Every single user here is broken down for you, and there's a lot of information here. GroupWise famously does not make this information easy to get at, but with the Blueprint and Disaster Recovery, you can get at that data really easily. Everything that's highlighted is marked as the system as an alert or an action item. For example, this person has been inactive for 811 days. So we're highlighting that for you. Maybe this person doesn't use email. Maybe you'd want to save a license. Other things like the user might be approaching their threshold for storage on the system will be highlighted. If maybe most items exist in the mailbox that's over 90 days old, for example, that might show up as an alert. This person has 1% over 90 days, so that's under 90 days. But 99%, that's over 90 days, but it's not a lot of data. That's why it's not showing up as it's not even a megabyte. It's not showing up as an alert, but that kind of stuff is shown here. He has no mailbox limit, and it just goes on and on and on. Really, really great reporting here. That's another great feature of the system. Let's click home here. Those reports, daily reports, they're all configured from here. You got your daily status report, you got your error notification, your warning, your job completion, and your audit. And each one of these can be configured as such. In fact, when the system was first made available to customers 15 years ago, it never used to have any of these things. As far as reporting is concerned, the system just used to run. Can you imagine? And administrators, it ran so well that they didn't think about putting notifications. But of course, that was a feature that was requested for because, even though you're pretty sure that it's running, you like to have that notification that you have a backup, so you don't have to check. So of course, that's been in the system for quite a while. But it's just a funny story that it didn't actually start with that. Going back home here, push button disaster recovery. I'm not going to click on this button because this is a live system and I don't want to put it into disaster recovery. But clicking on that ambulance is what puts it on. It's an ambulance, so that's supposed to be funny, right? Puts it into failover mode. Okay, so back in the day, people used to just think that, okay, I'm going to click on that button and then I'm in DR. But as we know, it takes a little bit more to get into disaster recovery, okay? So there's a few steps that you need to take into consideration here, and we'll talk about that, and we'll wind down the webinar because it's probably the most important part. The bulk of the work necessary to get a disaster recovery system up and running is at the beginning, configuring it, making sure that it's working. You got to test it, you need to validate it, and you need to document it, okay? So once you've got that, then you can make use of one button and poof, I'm in business here. Now, clicking on one of my post offices and clicking on the disaster recovery tab here, you see the 3 steps for your disaster. Step 1, fail over. Step 2, migrate. And step 3, fail back rather. And you see towards the bottom here, all the configuration information related to that, okay? So the important things here, so the TCP/IP address of the disaster recovery post office is localhost. So obviously in this system, we're not going to be working in disaster recovery anytime soon because clients won't connect to localhost, but in your environment, that will be an IP address that clients can connect to. So how do you get your clients? That's the important part. You got to get your clients connected to that IP. So basically, there's a few ways to do this, and 9 times out of 10, this way involves DNS. So you're going to configure your DNS system with, it can be so simple as changing your DNS record, and you can run scripts on reload. So when a disaster happens, when you click that failover button, it can run scripts that can update your DNS. You can use DNS round robin. Basically, you're going to get your clients or the GroupWise client is pre-configured to connect to NGW name server 1 and NGW name server 2 if it can't get to the first one. So you can even make use of those host names for your disaster recovery server. You need to get your clients connected to that. And that is why under additional steps that may be taken, we list that out for you. Okay, because it's so important, and a lot of customers back in the early days of disaster recovery weren't really paying attention to the nuances here. It goes so far as to you have a disaster recovery plan button at the top here. You see where my mouse is? You click on that, and we have a PDF that was designed by the creator of the system based upon a real-world disaster recovery plan for a pretty large law firm. Okay, you can see here they had 3 offices. Okay, so your plan might not be 21 pages. It could be shorter, it could be longer. But the point of this is you need to go into detail about how you're going to configure your GroupWise server, how you're going to configure the links between your post office agents to make it so that that ambulance button will actually save your users. It's all spelled out over here in a real world example and case study of a disaster recovery that is set up and working at a customer with multiple sites. So this is something that is meant for you as a customer of the system to emulate and copy and create your disaster recovery plan based upon this blueprint. Okay, so that does it for the demo here. Let's go back to my slide deck here. The next slide is customer successes. So we have a couple of customer success stories. We have, did I say a couple? We have a lot of customer success stories. This system has been on the market for over 15 years, and it has saved many a GroupWise customer over the years. It was designed by Tay Kratzer. It's a great story about the creation of the system. He used to be a Novell PSE at the state of Utah. And state of Utah had a disaster, and he needed to go back to tape to get email back for the governor. And long story short, it took about 6 days to get the data off the tape restored into GroupWise and back in the governor's hand. So the little light bulb went off in Tay's head. Hey, there might be a market for a system that makes this a whole heck of a lot easier. And that was the birth of the system. Originally, it was called Landfill. I'm not quite sure why he decided to call it Landfill, but it was quickly rebranded by our marketing as Reload, and it is now rebranded at Micro Focus because the system came along to Micro Focus when they acquired the original company called Guava, GroupWise Disaster Recovery. So if you want more testimonials, feel free to call sales, and these are all at the ready. So that pretty much does it. We have a few minutes left. If there are any questions, now is the time. Q, have there been any questions posed?
All right, I don't see any questions, so I think we're good to go ahead and finish. Thanks, Stephen, for your time, for the information presented, and thanks everyone for being here. And like I said, look for a recording for this webinar to your email soon.
Thank you, everyone.